Let's speak to Neil Wallace, former deputy editor at The Sun. Neil, good morning to you.
Good morning.
What's your view of this story as it stands this morning?
Oh, that's a wide-ranging question. I think what you're seeing here is what happens in this kind of story, which is the longer it goes on, the more people come forward and say, actually, something similar happened to me. And what you're seeing unraveling here is a sort of common narrative. And that, I think, is damaging for the presenter. I think it will probably get worse. And I think it puts more and more pressure on them to actually go public and stand up and say, actually, this is what happened, and just be open about the situation, because it gets more cloudy, more complicated as time goes by, and that's to the benefit of no one, I believe.
But ultimately, if the Sun was so convinced of this story in the first instance, why has that newspaper not named this individual?
Well, I don't think it's helpful for the BBC to be trying to attack the newspaper that's exposed behaviour at the BBC. Frankly, I think that looks over-defensive. Now, the reason is absolutely simple, and it's the same reason the BBC hasn't named the presenter, the same reason that no other newspaper. This is the front page story amongst almost every newspaper in Britain at the moment. No one has named them because of the law. The law says it's extremely difficult to name them. And so it's not that the Sun's running away from it. They would love to name the person. It's just how the law has now developed over privacy.
But with respect, it's not just the BBC that may be questioning the Sun's handling of this story. People like David Yelland, former editor of The Sun, has questioned the Sun's handling of this story as well, and why so little evidence has been put into the public domain surrounding those initial allegations that the Sun ran with at the end of last week.
Well, that all comes into the same issue, and I'm not here to defend the Sun. And frankly, David Yelland, who was a notorious failure as editor of The Sun and has fallen out very publicly with the paper, is not a credible witness, in my opinion. But the whole issue of identity, jigsaw identity, what you can and can't say, for instance, you, like nobody else, is even talking about the gender of the young person at the centre of this story. That's how politically and legally difficult it is. So it's a side issue, frankly.
Where do you think this story goes from here?
Well, I think what we're seeing, aren't we, that, you know, the first story broke on Friday. It's Wednesday morning now. It has been all over. It's been leading the BBC News. It's been leading all the newspapers, and it continues to develop. I think really the only culmination is for the presenter to come forward and put their side of the story. If the story is not true, and it is very noticeable, with the greatest of respect to you, that there has been no specific denials of anything. It would have been very easy.
Well, there's been no comment whatsoever. That's the issue, isn't it?
Well, if I could just finish. There are very specific allegations in this, that very large amounts of money were passed from a famous middle-aged BBC presenter to a much young guy whose parents say has a drug problem. None of that has been specifically denied, and you would have expected it to be denied if it was untrue.
Well, with respect, it has absolutely been denied by that young person who, in a lawyer's statement, said the story is rubbish and told the Sun that actually the story was rubbish when they were approached at the end of last week. Yet the Sun still ran with the story.
Well, it's very easy to give very generalised comments. Do you remember when Boris Johnson described some story about him fathering a child as an inverted pyramid of piffle? Turned out to be completely true, and he got sacked from the government he was serving in at the time as a result. So generalised denials carry very little weight, really. The issue of the denial that was sent by WhatsApp fairly late on the night of publication from a quite disturbed young person presented the Sun with an issue. What the Sun has got, and nobody has gainsaid this, they have concerned parents who are not have not asked for money, have not been paid for money, who went to the police in April, who went to the BBC, and they only ended up at the Sun because of the complete failure of the BBC to tackle the issue. All they wanted was this man to stop paying their child large sums of money that they say, and I certainly have no evidence, and I doubt whether you do too, that they're telling anything but the truth about their concerns about drug abuse by their young child.
But I just wonder whether, given that obviously there's a lot of pressure on the BBC to come clean about specifically that situation where the parents came forward and why that wasn't fully investigated at the time, is there also, because the Sun have not answered that question about why they decided still to publish when there was the denial from the young person, do they also need to explain themselves?
I think that it's up for the Sun to decide what it needs to explain. What I do know is that the allegations that the parents took to the police in April are largely what they took to the BBC in June, that the BBC then made sort of cursory examinations of, and they did nothing about for 7 weeks until the Sun forces into the public arena when they publish the story. Now, I don't think anybody seriously is suggesting that this is not an important, significant story. Otherwise, it wouldn't be leading your news bulletin, would it? Or BBC nationally, it is leading. Or the Times and the Telegraph both are leading on the story this morning, for instance. It is seen and is accepted to be an important story, and it needs to be resolved.
We spoke yesterday to Alan Rusbridger, former editor of The Guardian, and he made the point that there is animosity between some parts of Fleet Street, as was, and the BBC. Is that your view of this? How much of that might be a factor in all of this?
It might be a side factor because, you know, there is an ongoing issue about how the BBC is funded, etc. But I really don't believe the BBC would be leading every bulletin on their own story if they did not think this was a story. I don't believe it would be dominating the entire media landscape for 5 or 6 days if this was some sort of drummed up Alan Rusbridger fantasy about it's all about jealousy of the BBC.
To be fair, he wasn't suggesting that. He was just making the point that actually that animosity exists and believes that may well have been part of this story.
Well, Alan Rusbridger can think that if he wants. If he feels the need to grind that axe, then it's typical Alan Rusbridger, frankly.
Neil, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. Neil Wallace, former deputy editor at The Sun.